Blender for Noobs.
Hello and welcome back to the Secrets of Blender Modeling at the Berkey spacecraft. In part 12, we're going to be looking at doing the textures of the spacecraft. So things are getting pretty exciting for our spacecraft. We got all our details done. Like I said, I'm going to be adding a little bit more detail around the front and probably around the back and different places that I think needs it. But moving right along, we're going to be doing the textures. So let's go ahead and get started with that. I am basically going to be using the same texture along the entire spacecraft, except for the solar panels. That's going to be different, but just going to be using the same texture and varying the brightness basically of it. So let me move this out here so we can see it. And let's go ahead and start with the outer hull here. Let's go back to our materials. And right now we just have this basic blue on here. So in order to start creating our texture, what we need to do is we need to do some UV unwrapping. And everywhere we're going to do a texture, we need to UV unwrap, otherwise the texture won't show up. So I'm going to come over to this window here and choose UV Image Editor, which is where we can do our UV work. And let's just move this over a little bit more. And I'm going to go ahead and X out our reference image. And then we can see that we're left with the UV editor, or the UV mapping window. Okay, so if we tab into edit mode here and select all, I'm going to go ahead and unwrap these. So I'm just going to choose U on the keyboard. And if we were going to be creating textures in certain places on this piece right here, such as placing lettering or something like that, we would want to mark some seams and unwrap this very specifically. But since this texture is basically going to be covering this whole surface, and I want it to cover the whole surface, I'm just going to choose U and do a Smart UV Project. And just accept the defaults and click OK. And what this does basically is it takes all the faces of our object here and just flattens it out nice and neat for us. So once we have that projected, we come down here to UVs and we want to export the UV layout. And what I usually do when I do UVs is I create another directory. I'm just going to call this UV, create new directory. And I want to export all the UVs. PNG format is fine. For the size, because of the complexity of the spaceship and we want to get a little bit better detail, I'm not going to use the default 1024. I'm just going to bump this up to 2048 by 2048. And the fill opacity of 0.25 is fine. And for the name of this, I'm going to change this to outer hull underscore UV. And go ahead and export your UV layout. Okay, and before we go ahead and unwrap anything else, we'll just stick with this and we'll use this as the basis for creating our texture. So I'm just going to tab back in object mode. And now I'm going to go ahead and move over to Photoshop to start creating our basic hull texture. Now, if you don't use Photoshop, if you use GIMP, you can do pretty much the same things with GIMP if you're familiar with GIMP. Or if you have a different graphics program, you can do that. If you'd rather use different textures, of course, feel free to do that. But I wanted to create these textures from scratch just in case there's anybody out there that is interested in doing this. So what I'm going to do is just open our textures or our UV layout that we just created. And by default, if we look at the image size, it is 2048 by 2048, which is what we sized it at. These lines that you see here are the unwrapped UVs, and the thickness of these lines is the 0.25 that you've seen in the options when we exported them. Now for the layer 0, I usually come over here and just rename this to UV, just so I remember that that's our UV layer. And I'll be turning that off when I go ahead and export our final texture. So in order to create our texture, I'm going to use kind of like this area right here just as a basis, because it's a nice area here that has all the faces in it. So I'm just going to come over here and choose my objects and choose a square and just create a box here, so just as a kind of a reference point. So I'll know where that area is at. And let me Control D to deselect that. And I'm just going to Control plus if you're using Photoshop and just zoom in here into that area, maybe minus one time. That's Control minus. Okay, so this square area is the basic area that I'm going to be working with. So what I'm going to do is create a new layer. And just so you know, this technique that I'm going to be using, it's roughly based on a technique that I got off the internet, how to create a spaceship texture using Photoshop. Fairly simple way to create a basic texture, and then working from that, I've kind of modified it to create it my own way. So the first thing I'm going to do, I think I'm just going to name this layer background. We need a base color for our background. Come over here and grab the paintbrush, and I'm going to switch these so it's white and just dump white in there. And let me just drag this down so we can see our UVs. And go ahead and create a new layer. Bring this layer up here. Alright, so I'm going to select I'm going to use the rectangular tool here, and I'm just going to start drawing some rectangles. And hold down the left button, and I can continue to draw some rectangles and just kind of get some various rectangles in here. Okay, with all those selected, then I can take my paint bucket tool here and I'm going to change the color to a kind of a gray here and just dump it there. And then kind of the same thing again, create a new layer, go back to our selection tool and just start creating some more layers in here. And choose the paintbrush, and this time make it a little bit darker. And then again, I'm just choosing Control D to deselect the selections there. And in this case, I'm going to add a little bit of color in here. And I'm going to put a little bit of blue in here. Use the paint bucket tool, dump that in there, and of course way too blue, so I'm just going to go to the opacity and turn that down quite a bit. Basically barely visible there. And then I'm going to go to layer 2 and just change the opacity here, something more like what I want it to be. And same thing with layer 1. Bringing that down quite a bit. Control D on that. Okay, and then another layer. And I'm going to go ahead and name this layer Bump. And you'll see why in a little bit here. And go back to my selection tool, and I'm just going to start creating some more rectangles here. These being a little bit smaller, a little bit more precise. Okay, and back to the paint bucket, and I'm going to change this to a darker color here. And change the opacity so that they're still visible but not quite as much. And Control D, and then if we turn off our UV layer, then we can kind of see what we're coming up with here. And in fact, we don't need that layer on at all right now. Okay, and we don't need this square shape anymore, so I'm just going to select that and delete that. And if I Control minus out, then basically this is our texture that we have. And basically just shift select all these layers. And if I hold down the Alt key and then drag with the left mouse, it'll duplicate this. And basically I'm just going to duplicate this texture all across the page. So just using the Alt key. And then with all those layers, I'm just going to shift select all the way down. Actually, I don't want that last one. And Alt duplicate these and just kind of change them up a little bit. And you notice if I merge them, getting that dark line, I don't really want that dark line because if I do, that'll show up quite a bit on the model. So I don't want a white line and don't want a dark line there. So I can just use the Control key to kind of finely move that. Alt select that and just move it over to there. Duplicate this one. And now I can come down here and just choose this one and move it with the left button into place. And duplicate this one. So just basically a lot of duplications of the texture that we created. Okay, and I'm just going to save this. And just good, a good idea to save it as your whatever your graphics program is in its normal format. That way, if we need to ever come back in here and change anything, we have all our layers and everything. So let's save that. And I'm going to come back and do a save as, and this is going to be our actual texture. So I'm going to come into here. I'm going to create a new directory called textures. And I'm just going to save this as a JPEG and change the name. Instead of UV, outer hole underscore texture. And just going to accept the defaults there. Okay, so we have our basic texture, but I want to do one more thing, and that is I want to come in here and I want to create a bump map. So everywhere that we didn't put the bump texture there, we're going to delete. So I'm just going to shift select all these, delete those, delete. Okay, so we're left with all our pieces that are actually just the bump areas. And I'm just going to save this one as well. And I'm going to bring it over to the textures. And I'm going to call this outer hole underscore bump. And once we have that saved, we can go ahead and just select all of the bump layers. Shift select all the way down here. Right click and choose merge layers. And the opacity now is at 100%. If you have your paint bucket and set it to black, what we want to do is just make sure that we fill in all of these layers black. So basically we just want to make sure that all of these areas are turned black. And there's probably an easier way to do this. I'm not a Photoshop expert, so I'm going to actually sit here and fill in all of these little squares. So I'm going to speed this up for you so you don't have to sit here and wait on me to do this. Okay, so there we have it. So why am I doing this? Well, I've come up with this idea that the areas that have the darker gray squares, I'm going to use a bump map to actually indent those areas. Now I could just use this bump map and make random squares and indent sort of like panels on the spaceship that are indented, but I think it's going to be kind of interesting to have the indents match the actual texture that we did, and that's why I didn't just take a bunch of black squares and just randomly duplicate them all over the place. I'm actually using the squares that are in place that are the darker gray. So we'll see how this turns out. So once that is done, I'm just going to choose save and then do a save as, and under textures I'm going to change this to JPEG, and this will be our basic bump map. So once that's done, we can go back to Blender and we can start checking our texture and see how this is going to turn out. Okay, so back in Blender, we're going to be looking at continuing to create our materials and assign the textures to them. And just wanted to make a mention of this painting. I haven't said it before, but the name of this painting is The Eye in the Sky. So just if anybody was curious, that's what the name of it is. Alright, so I'm going to go back to our screen here, and I'm going to start with this piece right here, which is our hull underscore outer material. And we're going to be setting this up to have our material correct here. Let me just turn this on here. Just select that one layer so we can see what we're dealing with. Okay, so looking at our hull material here, I'm going to go over here on the screen to the node editor and hit N to get rid of that menu there. And let's go ahead and choose full screen, control up arrow. Okay, and by default, of course, all we have is this diffuse node with the output material. And I'm going to be adding a lot of nodes here, so don't panic if you haven't worked with nodes too much. We're going to get a good screenshot at the end so you can see the entire setup, but I'm going to go step by step to create these nodes. So the first thing we're going to do is let me just delete this one, so I'm going to select it, X delete that, and we'll start with, we'll start at this side and just go forward as we add our nodes here. So I'm going to do a Shift A, and first thing I'm going to add is I'm going to add a texture coordinate node, and just put that up there, and do a Shift A, and we're going to add a mapping node, which is under vector. So vector mapping, bring that up there, and go ahead and take the UV into the vector there. Next, do a Shift A and go to texture, and we want to add this Voronoi texture here. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but that's the one we want. And just hook these together from vector to vector. And another Shift A. And we're going to go to color and add a gamma node. Just add that in there. And we're going to hook this one color to color. And I'm going to change this gamma to just 5, hit enter. And I'm going to come over here, let's move this over here, just G, move that one over, Shift A, and create, go to shader and create a mix shader. Drop that one in there. And we're just going to go from, in this case, we're going to go from color to the FAC node. And you'll notice that was at 0.5. We're going to leave that at the default. So put that in there. And another Shift A, we're going to do another mix shader. So drop that one in there. In this case, we're going to go from the shader into this first shader here. And we're going to leave this back at 0.5. Okay, and then we can grab this material output and move it down a little bit. And we're just going to go from shader to surface right here. And this doesn't make a whole lot of sense right now the way it's set up, but what I'm doing is I'm setting up the way that the paint is going to look on this material, and then bring the texture into it as well. So let's back up again, and let's select this one, and I'm just going to do a Shift D to duplicate it, and bring this down here. Same thing, actually, don't really need the mapping, but it won't hurt. Shift D to duplicate it, and just going to go from UV to vector. And in this, for this texture coordinate, we're setting it up to read the UVs on the UV mapping that we did. In this case, it's not real critical because we basically took that UV mapping and did a smart UV project, and we're just taking all the faces. So this is not real critical for the way we did it, but it's just good practice to have this here. So if you ever need to adjust any of these settings, then you can do that. Okay, so over here we're going to do a Shift A and go to shader, and I'm going to add a diffuse shader. Put that right there. Shift D, duplicate that, just bring it down. Put it right there. And Shift A, and going to add a mix shader, and we'll just put that right there. Shift A, and we're going to add a glossy shader, and we'll put that right there. And so let's start adjusting these colors on these shaders that we have. For this, you can really kind of play around with the colors on what you like, but what I've come up with in my test is a certain color, sort of like a bluish type of color. In order to get that, what I'm going to do is just choose the hex and type in here, and it's going to be AFC9E7. Hit enter, and you can see that it's kind of in the bluish area. And when we get done with this texture, of course, you can come back and you can play with these colors and you can change it the way you like it. But I just think it's a good idea to get it the way that I've set it up right here, so you can get the same effect. And then after you get the same effect, then you can go back and change it the way you want it. So I'm going to go from vector here into color. And for this mix shader, I'm going to leave it at the 0.5, which is going to get both of the difference between these two diffuse shaders. I'm going to change this color on the hex. I'm going to put in 404149, and that's just kind of a dark color there. And I'm just going to bring this into the top shader and this one into the bottom. And leave, like I say, that FAC is going to be 0.5. And for the glossy shader, come down to the color, and we'll change the hex to 00B7D9. Enter. And that gives us kind of a bluish color there. And I'm just going to run this shader into the top shader here, and this one into the bottom one there. And then we need to add a little bit more. I'm going to take this glossy, Shift D to duplicate, and just move it over here. And I'm going to change this to basically to white, so it's going to be E7, E7, E7. Hit enter. And as you can see, it jumped to the middle. This is really the default color that you get when you create a shader. And I'm just going to run this into the bottom of the shader here, and I'm going to change this roughness down to just 0. So 0 and enter. And up here, I'm going to do a Shift A, and I'm going to go to Input and come down here to Fresnel. I know I'm saying that wrong as well, but that's the one we want. And I'm just going to plug this. Let's move it over here. I'm going to plug the FAC into the FAC here. And again, that's left at 0.5. And I'm going to change this index of reflections IOR to 1.5. Enter. Okay, and then if we do a control up arrow, we can see we have this strange looking texture, and it's got these kind of different colors to it. But another thing that we need to do is come back to this area here, and I'm going to just shift select these two and G move it over and do a Shift A and go to texture and choose image texture and just drop it in there. And I'm going to do it open, go to our textures, and I'm going to choose the outer hole texture that we created. Okay, and do a control up arrow, and we'll see that this has changed with our texture on it, and it also has kind of a glossy look and also a little bit of strange color into it. Okay, and up arrow back to this. And now what we need to do, we have basically our texture there, but I want to add the bump mapping that we did. So I'm going to take this image texture, Shift D to duplicate, bring it over here. Let's bring it down here. And it's pointing to the texture that we had here, but we want our bump map, so I'm going to X this, choose open, go to our textures, and pull up our bump map that we created or saved. And so that's added in there. And then I'm going to do a Shift A, go to color and choose Mix RGB and drop it in here. And we're going to change this mix to multiply. And I'm going to change the FAC to 0.2. And I'm just going to go from the color to the second color here. And for the color output, I'm going to come down here to the displacement on our material output. And what that does is, just grab this and move it down, it's really taking this bump map, and I'm multiplying the bump map with this factor of 0.2, and it's going into the final displacement, which is going to consider those black squares that we created as the indentions or bumps. Now you can adjust those bumps with this 0.2 factor. So if we do a control up arrow, and this refreshes here, you can't really see it very well in this picture, but now we have some indentions in there. Hopefully you can see it on yours, and that will give us our bump mapping. So I'm going to do a control S save real quick, and we'll move on to our next material. So for the next one, what we're going to do is, I decided in some tests that I did not want to use the same material for this outer ring because these have those bump indentions on them, and when I did it on this material, it really didn't look good at all. It just had a lot of strange indentions on it. So I'm going to add create a new material for this. So I'm just going to do plus new material, and I'm going to call this, let's call it hull underscore outer underscore front. And I'm just going to minus this material out, so we're left with this material. And then I'm going to come back here, select this one, so I can grab the snow tree because it's very similar. I'm going to do a Shift B and just, actually I'm just going to do a B and select all of this and do a Control C, copy, and come back to this one. And while these are selected, I'm just going to delete on my keyboard and Control V paste, so we paste that node tree in. So right now it's the same exact material, but we're going to change it. And I'm going to do a control up arrow And really we're good for everything here except the bump map. We don't want the bump mapping, so all we got to do is select this, shift select that one, X delete, and we're good. When we control up arrow, we have basically the same material without the bump mapping, which is what we want. So if we choose this one, I'm going to do a control up arrow, get you a nice screenshot of this just in case you need to have an overall look at it. And same thing with this one. This is the setup for this one. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is the bridge. And this one I actually decided to do a separate material on it as well. So we'll go ahead and I was using the Greeble material, but I don't want to use that one because I'm going to be doing something special with the Greeble material. So I'm going to do new, choose new here. We're just going to call this bridge, and I'm going to minus this one out. I'm going to keep the glass there, that's fine for the windows. Actually, let's minus this glass out for a second just so the bridge material will be assigned to it. And go ahead and go back into this, and I'm just going to select the glass area and recreate it here. Do plus, choose glass and assign. Okay, so now we got our separate material. Control up arrow, come in here, and I'm going to do a shift A. I'm going to leave those there and do input texture coordinate. Bring that out. Do a shift A. I'm going to go to texture, image texture, bring that in there. Shift select these, just move them over a little bit. Do a shift A. And I'm going to go to color and choose a bright contrast. Bring that in and just start hooking these together. So I want to go from UV to vector, from color to the color here. And we can leave that color default, from color to color here. And I actually want to bring in a glossy as well. So shift A, go to shader and add the glossy shader, and come over here and just move this over here. Do a shift A, go to shader and choose a mix shader, just drop it in there and just hook this one to the bottom. And I'm going to leave this default 0 and this at 0.2, that's fine, but I'm going to change this one over to 0.2 because I actually want more of the diffuse to show up in the glossy. So I'm going to come back over here and I'm just going to grab our texture. So do an open, go to textures, and just grab the outer hole texture. We're going to be using this outer hole texture pretty much throughout. The only reason we use the bump one is to create those indentions. And then of course the solar panel texture is the only other texture that we're going to be using. But we're going to create that in a bit. So then we're going to look at the brightness and contrast. And I'm going to use a 0.4 on there, and I'll leave the contrast as it is. And this is something that, you know, when you do your final render, you can adjust this brightness contrast to how you think it looks best. So this is the basic setup for the bridge material. So that is assigned to the bridge, and I'm also going to use that material actually for these pieces here. So going to undo that and bring in the bridge, and just so we can differentiate these pieces here, I go back to this one. You can see it is using the other material, but it's using the viewport color the same as the bridge, so we can just kind of change that around a little bit just so we know that it's using something different than that one. In fact, we know it's the same as this, so we want to use that pretty much the same color just for a quick reference type thing. Okay, and before we go any further, there's another piece of modeling that I want to do, and I'm just going to turn on, I don't want to turn on the lighting, but I want to turn on everything else. And what I decided to do is have kind of some running lights for our craft here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put one on either side of this little piece here, and then I'm going to put one on the outside of the solar panels. So I'm just going to do a shift A, and I'm going to create a UV sphere, and I'm going to T into my options here, and I'm just going to bump this down to like 12 and 6 because it doesn't need to be very big. T out of that and bring this up where we can look at it, and S to scale it way down. Just going to move it over and down and get it into place. Go into 7 top view, and I'm going to put it somewhere along here. About right there. Scale it down some more. About right there. And before I go any further, let's go ahead and give it the material that it needs. And I'm just going to do a new material, choose new, and I'm going to call this light underscore running for running lights. And I'm going to change this to be an emission, so choose that. And on the strength, I'm going to give it 500, which is extremely bright, but due to the small size that it's going to be, should work out okay. And I'm just going to change the color. Let's go into the hex and change it to FFDDBC. Enter. And that gives it kind of an orange looking color. Again, this is a preference thing, so once you get finished with this, you can go back and tweak some of these and change some of these colors if you like. So go back to our view here. I'm just going to do a control up arrow so we can see what we're doing. And for these lights, I am going to duplicate it, but I'm going to do an Alt-D duplication. And what that does is it gives it the same data, so we don't have to go back and assign it the different material. And I'm just going to move it across here, just so it's kind of in the same general area. Bring it just above there. Now in my final screenshot, I'm not going to be able to see this, but if you want to do different shots around this craft, then it'll be nice to have it there. I'm going to do another Alt-D, duplicate it, and just going to move it out to the end of the solar panels here. 7 top view. See if we can get it in place. And just going to drop it right in there. And 7 top view. Do another Alt-D. And just going to move it straight across on the other end of the other solar panel. So if we look at it, it's just kind of barely sticking up, and we can adjust that as we need. Okay, control up arrow, go back to our view here. So if we select this sphere, just to show you, we have this, and if we go to our object data, it's got this, the sphere name, which in fact we probably want to come in here and go ahead and fix that, right? Actually, we have the 4 there, we can fix that later. But if you tab into edit mode on these, and let me just zoom out, and I do a S scale, scale them way up, you will notice that it is affecting all 4 of them, and that's exactly what we want. We want these to be exactly the same. So I'm just going to Control Z to undo that. Okay, so that is our running lights. Alright, for our next material we're going to be looking at, let's select this one here, go to our materials, and we have our hull center details. So let's go ahead and work on that. Just to save time, what we can do, I'm just going to go to the bridge here, select this one, and select all these, do a Control C copy, go back to our material here, delete these on the keyboard, and Control V paste, and Control up arrow to look at them. So basically we're good on the texture, we're using the same texture. Let's check this color here. I'm going to change this color, let's go into the hex and change it to C 6D7E7, hit enter, and that's just a slight bluish color, and then connect this back up. For the brightness, I'm going to choose a negative 0.596, enter. And for the color here, I'm going to leave this as it is, leave the roughness as it is. Color here, this is fine, the default, which is E7, E7, E7. And the factor here, I'm going to leave it as a 0.2. So this is all good. And if we control up arrow and look at our material, you notice that really the only thing to change in here is the brightness. So same thing with this. I'm going to do a select all, Control C copy, and I'm going to go to this material in here, which is the hull center inner material. Delete this, Control up arrow, Control V paste, and really the only thing I'm changing on this one is the brightness. So I'm going to change this brightness here to negative 0.358. And this is our setup for that material. Control up arrow, and this is just a little bit brighter than the other material. Okay, so we're getting there, we're almost done. We have the greebles to do and also the solar panels. So let's go ahead and do the greebles next. And the greebles, I decided to do something very special, which is to give them a material that would add little tiny lights to them, so that it'd give it the idea that there's even more detail there than what we see, almost like small city lights type of thing. So what we need to do first is we actually need to create the specularity map that we're going to use for these greebles. So we'll need to unwrap these, but just a quick note before I go any further. Any of these materials that we're separating out, like the bridge materials, or actually these parts, like the separate parts here, they all need to be unwrapped. So if you happen to do like a test render or anything and you're not seeing your materials show up, the reason is they have to be unwrapped. So we unwrap this one. For this one, you just want to go to the UV image editor, let's X that out, and tab into edit mode, A select all, do a U, and we're just going to unwrap this one like it is. And we don't really need to save the UV because we're using the exact same texture throughout. It just has to be unwrapped so that the texture knows how to map onto it. So I'm going to deselect that one, go to this one, it's going to be the same thing, tab in edit mode, A select all, U, and I'm going to just do a smart UV project on this one, select OK, and that one's unwrapped. And really the same for all these other pieces here. A select all, do a smart UV project. Tab back out, select this one. Unwrap that. Tab back into object mode, and like I said, for this area here, these two, I'm just going to duplicate it and put it on the other side. So those are already unwrapped, so that's fine. Okay, now we need to unwrap the greebles. Now, due to the complexity of these and the amount of faces that we have, it's very possible that this could crash your Blender. So I very strongly suggest that you do a Control S save. Make sure you have everything saved before you unwrap these. It took probably my computer a good 3 to 5 minutes to unwrap these. So basically you just want to select them, tab in edit mode, same as before. I'm going to do an A and choose U and do a smart UV project and select the defaults and then wait until it finishes unwrapping. Okay, so once it's done and hopefully Blender didn't crash, you should see something similar to this here, where you have a huge amount of UV mapping, and we're just going to go into UVs here, do an export UV layout, go to our UV folder, and just going to change this to, let's call it Greebles _UV, and I'm going to choose all UVs, and I'm going to change the size to 2048 by 2048 because I want to have it pretty good resolution. Default field opacity 0.25 is fine, and export UV layout. And now that all that's done and we've exported the UV layout, I'm going to deselect this, tab back into object mode, and I'm going to do another Control S save because pretty much, I mean, we did a fairly big operation there and we don't want to lose that. Okay, so now that we have that exported, I'm going to go into the graphics program and I'm going to open up our UV map there, which is the Greebles. And what we want to accomplish here is we want to put very small black dots across almost the entire image, not the entire image, but a lot of it. So in order to do that, I'm just going to Control plus zoom in quite a bit, and let's move up to the top left corner here. Actually, it's kind of hard to see there, so let me pick one of this open area here. And I'm going to choose the shape, and I'm just going to leave it on the square shape. And I want the color to be black. And basically, I want it to fill it in like that. So when I do that, you'll notice it's creating a new shape, which is what we want. And it's going to make very, very small square shapes. Just kind of randomize it a little bit. And probably, in this case, the smaller the better. Okay, once you have a number of squares there, I'm just going to shift select all these shapes and right click and choose merge layers. So all this is one layer, and I'm going to choose my selection tool here and the control minus back out so I can see what I'm doing. And I'm just going to move this up here right around there, and then I'm going to alt drag it, and I'm just going to duplicate it across all this. Now when I duplicate this, let's look at our full view here. Mainly I don't want to duplicate it too much along this area because this is basically the platforms that is below the ship. This one as well, these small platforms, this is the top and bottom of those platforms. This is that little round shape. We don't really need it too much on that, but pretty much everywhere else you can duplicate those shapes all over the place. So probably the easiest way to do that is just duplicate them across one layer, and then you can duplicate those layers further down. So I'm just going to alt drag this over. And it doesn't really have to be exactly covering everything. We just want enough here, and we're going to have tons of these. Basically what we're creating here with these black dots is little lights that are going to be showing. So really no need to go really crazy with trying to cover every single piece of this material here, or this texture. Okay, so once I have that, I can go ahead and I'm just going to shift select all of these and merge those layers, and let me control minus out a little bit so I can see. And now I can just take this and alt select, drag it down a little bit, drag that down, and just basically just duplicating these dots all the way throughout this thing here. And then like I said, for this area, I'm just going to drag it, yeah, probably over there, right there. Just kind of avoiding those circular areas there. Okay, something like that. And now when I turn off this layer, actually let me just call this the UV layer. And when I turn that off, we're left with a bunch of black dots. And we're just going to save this to a file, save as. And this will be our texture. So I'm going to go back to the textures folder. And I'm going to make this a JPEG. And I'm just going to call this, let's call this Greebles underscore spec or specularity underscore texture, and go ahead and save that. And then back in Blender. So now we have our specularity material that we need. We're ready to go ahead and create our Greebles material. So we'll select that, and we'll select the Greebles material here, and we want to go to our node editor. So again, we can save ourselves some trouble. I'm going to go ahead and copy one of the other materials. I'm going to choose this whole outer, and let's just select all that, Control C, and go back to the Greebles. Make sure we're on there, just delete that, and Control V here. So right now we have the exact same material as the outer hull, but we're going to change it around a little bit. So Control up arrow. And the first thing we're going to do is we don't want those indentions on the Greebles. So again, we're going to just shift select these two here, X delete. And what we're going to change is in between here. So I'm just going to grab this, G, move it out, and go ahead and do a control. And if you hold down your control button, you get a little knife when you use your mouse button to select, and just slice through that, and it will cut that little noodle there. Okay, so I'm going to do a Shift A and go to texture, and I want image texture. I'm going to move this here, do a Shift A, go to shader, I want a mix shader, and I'm going to put this over here, and Shift A, and I'm going to do a color mix RGB and put that there. And then the last one we want, Shift A, I'm going to do a shader and make an emission shader and put it right here. So I'm going to go ahead and take this mix shader here and put it into the top of here, and I'm going to take this emission and put it in the bottom there. And I'm going to change this color, because this is actually going to be the color of our lights, and choose that, go over to hex, and I'm going to change this, and sorry, it's probably kind of hard to see what I'm doing here, but choose this, and I'm going to make this a D4DCFF, which is just a slight bluish color. And for the strength, I'm going to change that over to 5, hit enter. And up here on our image texture, what we want is our light, our bump lights, actually our specularity map that we created. So go to textures, and we want our Greebles spec texture. And on this mix here, we're going to change the FAC from 0.5 to 1, hit enter. And we're going to go from our color and move this straight into the FAC. And I'm going to change this, just change this to black. And from the color of the mix shader, we're going to go into the FAC on this one. And from the shader, we're going to go to the surface. Okay, and if we did everything right, actually let's get a full screenshot. This is quite a bit of information here, I know. Try to move this in a little bit. And so right now this is our tree. And do a control up arrow, come back here, and once this refreshes, you'll see we have our normal material, but we have these little dots of light on it, which is exactly what we want. So I'm going to go ahead and do a control S save. And next we're going to be doing the textures on the solar panels. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with texturing these solar panels. Just going to select them here, go to our UV image editor window, and tab into edit mode. There's not really a lot here that we need to unwrap, which is good. And because we have it mirrored, we can just do one side and it'll actually mirror the texture over to the other side. So we don't need to do both. So for these, I'm just going to select the panel layer, go into 7 top view, and tab into edit mode, select all, and choose U. And for these, I'm going to project from view. That way, not only will we get the top side here, we'll get the bottom side as well, and we can do the textures on them really both at once. So control up arrow, go to this view here, and we can go ahead and scale this up so it fits in our window. Something like that. And go down to UVs, export UV layout, go to our UV directory. And I'm just going to call this solar panel UV. And we want all UVs. In this case, we don't need to, go into high detail, so I'm just going to leave them at 1024 by 1024 the default, and export UV layout. Okay, tab back to object mode, and we can turn on these other levels if we want to. And then go into our graphics editing program, and I'm going to go ahead and open that UV. And I'm going to open my reference image for my solar panel. So choose open, go to reference images, and choose the solar panel image. And I'm just going to do a Control A to select all, Control C to copy, go back to our original image, and do a Control V, paste that in there. And while I'm here, I'm just going to change this to UV so I know that's the UV layer. And I can name this panel. And while on this layer, while I have this selected, go to my selection tool here, and I'm just going to hold the shift down and resize this down, hopefully to where it needs to be. Okay, something like that. And choose this again to apply. And I'm just going to Alt duplicate this and bring it out like this. Now luckily this image that I have here is it's a tileable image, so it fits together pretty nicely. Okay, so there is our basic texture. Just going to turn off this UV, not that we're going to see it because this pretty much covers everything anyway, but just out of habit, I'm going to turn that off. Go ahead and File, Save As, and save our solar panel UV Photoshop file, and do a Save As, and go to our textures, texture directory, call this a JPEG, and change this to texture, and save that. Okay, and then back in Blender, now we can go to our node editor, and we already have our materials, and now hopefully you can kind of see why I changed all these different, gave them their own material names. That way we can easily apply whatever textures we want to them. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab this node tree and make it a little bit easier. Do a select all, Control C to copy, go back to the solar panel, delete that one, do Control V to paste that in, and then all we need to do is delete this displacement here. We don't need that anymore. And come up here, and we are going to X out this image, choose open, go to our textures menu, and choose our solar panel texture. So then you can see we have this solar panel texture showing across there. And it's really up to you if you want to leave it, change the glossiness of it. I'm going to leave that as it is right now, just to see how it looks. Do a Control S save, and let's go ahead and do a test render. Okay, so not bad at all. I think the color is contrasting a little bit too sharply with our overall look of our spacecraft. So what I'm going to do is come back here, and in the node tree, actually let me go to our model here and change this to rendered. And see if I can zoom in here. Just to get a nice contrast to that area. And in my node tree for the solar panel, I'm going to take these two, shift select those two, and just move those over. Do a shift A to add a node, go to color, and I'm going to bring in the hue saturation and just drop that in there. And maybe drop the saturation down to 0.5. See what that looks like. Maybe a little bit more, 0.2. Try 0.3. Okay, so a little bit closer to where I want it to be. And again, as you can see, no need to mess around in your graphics program trying to adjust shades and brightness, contrast, hue, all that. It can all be done with the nodes, which is really nice. Okay, so that pretty much finishes up texturing. What I'm going to do before we go to the next section is I'm going to change my my front. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that and use that as the rear section as well. I am decided not to put any details, any greebles on the front. Feel free to do that if you like on yours, but I'm just going to basically just duplicate this front and move it around to the rear of the spacecraft. And then for the next section, we're going to be looking at lighting in section 13.